beginning, I will ask you to please turn off your phones or put them on silent so we don't interrupt our speaker. And before I introduce our guest this evening, I have a couple of announcements as usual. I just want to remind you that in this series in Tahrir, the In Translation lecture series, we have one remaining lecture this semester, and it will be on November 22nd. It is by Rana Hisham Isa, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Oriental and Cultural Studies at the University of Oslo. And her talk is entitled Scribal Residues in Translation, the Arabic Bible in the Nahda and the Task of the Translator. For our other series, the parallel series at the new campus, we have another 2 lectures coming up, one towards the end of this month, actually on October 31st at 1 p.m. And this will be given by Walid Hamed, who is an actor, director, and translator. And he is the director of Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure that has shown more than once in Cairo with great success. And his talk, therefore, is based on that Arabic adaptation that he did. And the talk is entitled When Shakespeare Speaks Egyptian Arabic, the case of Da'a Bida'a. And then finally, in the last talk in at the new campus is by my colleague in English and Comparative Literature, Professor Munira Suleiman, who will be lecturing on superheroes in translation, constructions, and deconstructions. And this will be on Monday, November 14th. We also have an additional event that we had talked about last semester with our friends and colleagues, Omar Nageti and Beth Stryker. So this is going to be a workshop in collaboration with Cluster, the Cairo Lab for Urban Studies, Training and Environmental Research. And it will take place on December 10th, which is a Saturday, here in Tahrir. And the workshop will be by invitation, actually. So if you're interested in participating, I will ask that you please leave your name outside in our guest book. And it will take place, as I said, from 10 to 2. And it is entitled Towards Developing a Critical Urban Lexicon. So those of you who are interested in the city, urbanity, and all the problems surrounding the lexicon that involves these entities, you are most welcome to join the workshop. We're obviously doing this from Arabic into English because that's where the problems lie for the urban planners and architects and media people who will be participating in the workshop. Okay, now I turn to our guest this evening, my friend and colleague, Mona Namoury, who is assistant professor at Tanta University. She is also a creative writer and an accomplished literary translator. She did her PhD on the figure of the alien in Ursula K. Le Guin's science fiction works. And her research interests include children's literature, the fantastic and mystical, as well as feminist literature and literary criticism. Mona is a dynamic and prolific member of the Cairo literary cultural scene. She has published widely, actually, on various digital venues, including Masr al-Arabiya, Arabic literature in English, Al-Ayyam Al-Yawm Al-Jadid, Al-Balad, among others. As a translator, she has also published translations of Ahmed Zaghloul al-Shiti's ثلاثة عصافير كناري. She translated that into English under the title 3 Green Canaries. It was published in Metamorphosis in 2011. She's also translated Ammar Ali Hassan's short story حكاية الحب الأول, Tales of the First Love, published in 2 lines in 2015, and also the novella, or is it a novella? You did the whole collection?
Serious? No, only one.
Only one, all right. غرفة حجرتين وصالة by the late and great Ibrahim Aslan, that was translated under the title 2 Bedrooms and a Living. She is also the translator into Arabic of Ursula K. Guin's A Wizard of Earthsea, which is the focus of her talk this evening. And it has been translated into Arabic and published by the National Center for Translation under the title Sahir min Earthsea, and here it is. The book is available outside for sale for those of you who may be interested. I want to also thank Muna for being a dedicated follower of our series here in Tahrir, and a wonderful participant always in our discussions. She was also a very loyal participant in the workshops at the House of Translation that we had hoped would continue in collaboration with the National Center for Translation. But I have very, very special thanks for her this evening because she has actually insisted on going ahead with this lecture on time, despite a serious family emergency. And I have tried to dissuade her and have tried to persuade her that we can reschedule, but she absolutely insisted to go ahead. So really, thank you very much for being with us. And without further ado, help me welcome her here. Thank you, Mona.
Should I start?
Please go ahead.
Okay. Translating the fantastic. A Wizard of Earthsea as an example. A Wizard of Earthsea is a fantasy novel by critically acclaimed American science fiction and fantasy writer Ursula K. Le Guin. I always had trouble with how to pronounce her name because her husband seems to be of French origins. It's a Bildungs roman written in 1968, primarily for English-speaking young adult readers. It's a tale of growing up that engages readers at any age. A naturally gifted young wizard in a wizardry school, his name is Guin, shows off in front of his peers and summons a dead spirit. And with that dead spirit comes another dark force from the earth that is loosed upon the world. He looks for its name and nature in order to control it. It turns out that it has his name and his face. It is his dark side. By embracing his evil, by becoming fully responsible, Guin becomes integral and the wound of the earth is healed. Sometimes people age and die without actually growing up in the real sense of being responsible of their actions and acceptable of themselves. Although Le Guin writes science fiction and fantasy, she finds fantasy more suitable for the journey message because of its archetypal symbols. The labyrinth, the shadow, the wizard, the journey, the ghost, the ring. These images suit a psychic journey taken by youth in order to understand themselves and face the world. But what is fantasy? What is fantasy and how different is it from the imaginary works of science fiction? Fantasy is a fiction genre that uses magic or other supernatural elements as a main plot element, theme, or setting. Many works within the genre take place in imaginary worlds where magic and magical creatures are common. It's one of few genres under the general term speculative fiction, and it also contains fantasy, science fiction, horror fiction, detective stories, magical realism. Contrary to a simple commercial stereotype about fantasy literature, it provokes the reader to speculate, think, and eventually get transformed. Or as Le Guin herself says, Quote, fantasy is a journey. It's a journey into the subconscious mind, just as psychoanalysis is. Like psychoanalysis, it can be dangerous and it will change you. End of quote. Fantasy is different from science fiction, which is also about imaginary worlds and creatures in that it departs from science. Whatever happens in science fiction abides by the natural law of science. Nothing that cannot happen in science will ever happen in a good science fiction story. In fantasy, on the other hand, anything can happen. The reader simply submits herself to the world of the writer. As a child, it's easier to let yourself be taken by another world. The more we grow, the more reasonable and logical we try to become, the further we get away from that wonderful world of fantasy. Fantasy and childhood, thus, are legitimately linked. Now, what are the major difficulties that face a literary translator? We have the typical problems that face any translators, finding the right equivalent. However, there is never a genuinely right literary equivalent. And then we have the more important issue of the style. Writers have peculiar ways of saying things, and that's exactly what makes the writing different from each other and from ordinary discourse. To try to provoke the same effect a literary text has in its own culture in a different one is an ambition any translator is entitled to have. Of course, but almost very few can perfectly claim. Then, what are the difficulties that face a literary translator of fantasy? And that's what the whole lecture is about. But if I say it now, you will all go home quicker than we expect. Let me start by explaining why I have chosen A Wizard of Earthsea. I have chosen A Wizard of Earthsea for three important reasons. Firstly, I had been enriched by Le Guin's body of work for more than 13 years since I did my PhD on her science fiction. Having been personally nourished by communicating with her during most of the time, I decided to introduce her fantasy in translation as I introduced her science fiction in academia. The Earthsea world is definitely the heart of her work. And then I fell in love with the story. No sane translator would ever give her creativity and soul to a work that she does not love. Secondly, there is the phenomenal effect of the Harry Potter series, starting 1997, on translating fantasy young adult literature in Arabic, of which Earthsea is an example. Harry Potter has achieved phenomenal popularity around the world. The cinematic versions of the books have added to this commercial phenomenon. There is a big industry in Britain, actually all over the world, affiliated with the Harry Potter souvenirs, tours, sites that are taken by tens of thousands of tourists every year. It has become what might be called a transmedia phenomenon. After a fruitful interview with the translation and publication department in Nahdat Misr, which is the publishing house of Harry Potter in Arabic, I was confirmed that there have been 13 editions of the first part of Harry Potter, the first of which was in 2002. That is to say, an edition almost every year. The translations have been in demand to the point that parts 5 and 6 were translated and printed in 1 year, which is 2008. The phenomenal success of Harry Potter in Arabic translation has encouraged Nahdat Misr to adopt translating Lord Tolkien's fantasy works in 2008. That is to say, 6 years after the first part of Harry Potter appeared in the Arabic market. 2 editions of Lord Tolkien's works have been printed ever since. However, the demand for Harry Potter is still high enough for the house to start the big, painful, slow process of editing all the previous translations. If it had not been for the central position occupied by fantasy in translation, the house would not have painstakingly been engaged in the editing process. Harry Potter fandom, Harry Potter culture, has been steadily increasing in Egypt since the publication of its Arabic translation. My son Yusuf is one loyal fantasy fan, Harry Potter in particular. On the other hand, Earthsea, the older fantasy, and probably the journal story for Potter, was aging before even being read in Arabic. The one book that I wish to see my son influenced by, because of what it contained of genuine wisdom and truth, was going to oblivion without being read in Arabic. The only impact of Harry Potter that I could notice in my son, and I could be very wrong, and I could be a protective mother, and I could be a mother that tends towards didacticism, I could be all that, is that he and his peers are more comfortable and easily adaptable with fantasy world. Yusuf has always been able to see things in translated Earthsea quicker and better than me. He had a special theory that Sigoi is the first wizard of all Earthsea, the one who raised the islands, was Guin herself. But for me, the mother, there are more values to be acquired from Earthsea by a young reader. I'm a middle-aged woman who have been raised in a culture that sees in children literature a way to teach, dictate, and raise children and teenagers. As Wafa Dukmak says in her unpublished PhD thesis from Leeds University on translating culture-specific items in Harry Potter, quote, certain culture-specific items represented by Islam in the first place and Arab nationalism in the second, in addition to certain political and ideological opinions, contribute heavily to the didactic and moralizing nature of Arab children literature, end of quote. Here is an emotional reason behind my translational choice. The third reason is that the young, vain, impulsive Wizard of Earthsea at part 1 ends up as being the archimage of all Earthsea, the greatest of all wizards. In later parts, he loses much of his magical power, but he discovers other enchanting powers in himself, like the ability to love a woman to the point of letting her leave and discover the world and fulfill herself. That is to say, the archimage, the greatest of all wizards, turns to become a feminist. This surely flatters the feminist part in me that has always criticized the severe and the dominant masculinity of fantasy and science fiction. These values I wished my children to learn. In fact, I wished all people to learn. I wished to see Guin, the main hero, as famous and influential as Potter. Perhaps I knew deep inside that it was fairly difficult, but I needed to try it by all means. This lecture is developing itself into an academic paper, but so far it's still very much the faulty experience of one translator who has done the literary translation of a great classical fantasy book. The translation, however, might not be equally great nor important. Like Nahdat Misr, I wish now I could edit many things and refine many parts. For me, it remains a project in process. The people who translate science fiction and fantasy, the speculative fiction, the speculative genre translators must, first of all, know these genres. They need to know the special vocabulary related to science and technology, as well as the general ideas frequently seen and found in fantasy. These particular genres tend to accumulate ideas, images, and symbols. The writers usually rework, expand on these ideas. A translator of those speculative genres should have enough knowledge of the history and development of these genres. This is, again, still not enough. They also have to be exceptionally creative ones, as these books are full of names for things that do not exist in reality, the products of the writer's imagination. Translators of science fiction and fantasy deal with everything from food names to names belonging to different life forms, places, objects, military ranks, or even names of drinks or institutions. In any literary translation, these are usually called culture-specific references, and they refer to different aspects of everyday life, such as education, politics, history, art, and institutions, legal systems, units of measurements, place names, foods and drinks, sports and national pastimes, as experienced in different countries and nations of the world. But when it is a fantasy work that is being translated, the references become even more difficult to deal with because they do not really exist. They refer to items in a culture that exists in the writer's imaginary world only. When translating these to another language and creating ways to induce the same feeling in the target culture as the source culture, there is always bound to be some loss of meaning. Despite this inevitable loss, creativity is still key when translating in order to retain as much of the ambience of the original text as possible. And then there is the issue of style. Style is most important in fantasy. As Le Guin herself says, quote, "In fantasy, there is nothing but the writer's vision of the world. There is no borrowed reality of history or current events. There is no comfortable matrix of the commonplace to substitute for the imagination, to provide ready-made emotional response and to disguise flaws and failures of creation. There is only a construct built in a void, with every joint and seam and nail exposed. To create what Tolkien calls a secondary universe is to make a new world, a world where no voice has ever spoken before, where the act of speech is the act of creation. The only voice that speaks there is the creator's voice, and every word counts." End of quote. Now, what were the difficulties that I faced as a translator in translating this fantasy work, which is A Wizard of Earthsea? The first challenge was to come up with acceptable, attractive, non-existent equivalents for many invented terms. Some of these are explained in the next parts of Earthsea. Some of them are never explained at all. Examples are the term old powers, capitalized. Old power, this necessitated a strategy of addition based on connotations of the term. I know what the old powers are. They are the fire, the earth, the wind, and it is translated into قوى الكون العتيقة, which literally means old powers of the universe. And then there were many references to names of mythical figures and words which become clearer in the coming parts, like El-Farin, Eris Agbi, Morid. This acquired only preservation and transliteration, and they were translated into El-Farin, Eris Agbi, Morid, respectively. And of course, and of course, there were the invented plants like the white hallows, which acquired preservation and transliteration, and it is translated into Zahrat al-Hallows al-Bayda. There was even a bigger problem, translating all the different categories of the word wizard that had no equivalence in Arabic, and most of the equivalents were actually of negative connotations. Like there is a hierarchy, a descending hierarchy in all of Earthsea world. There is the Archimage, the great wizard, the greatest of all wizards, As-Sahir al-Akbar, and he is always elected to be the headmaster of the school of wizards. And then there is a mage, Sahir Kabir, which means an experienced and acclaimed wizard. Here I could have used Sahir Alim, which exists actually in Arabic repertoire in the Quranic references to the wizards facing Moses alayhi salam in chapters Al-A'raf and Yunus, verses 112 and 79 respectively. However, because of the negative connotations associated with the term in the culture, I thought of finding another word for this addition. And then there is a wizard, which means a wizard who is experienced enough to gain his magical stick. And then there is sorcerer, mushawiz, which means an apprentice wizard without stick. And then we have a lot of other people who are affiliated with magic somehow. We have the wizard worker, muharrik al-taqs, the one who can change directions of winds and clouds. We have the enchanter, al-munshid, the one who sings the sagas of heroes and wizards. We have the heal all, al-mu'alig, one who heals by spells and herbs, and the three references are fairly equal in power. There's also the witch, As-Sahira, a female wizard, and it has negative connotations in part 1, and there is a wizard child, Sahir Tifl, a term given only to Gid, the main hero, in part 1. There was also a problem of translating invented words for invented animals, herbs, and things, like the otak, which is an animal, the were light, a device to light the way. The periot leaves, أوراق نبات البريات الشافية. All three have been transliterated and explained in footnotes. And then we have the language of the Kargs. The Kargs are some people living in the wizard universe who attacked Gid's village, and again, it was an invented language. That was preserved as it is. It was just transliterated. Wula, Atwa, Wula, Atwa. And we have the first spell in the whole book are some words the child Gid utters without understanding. They are transliterated without any explanation. I did not want to find the cultural equivalent. The spells may repeat themselves in the coming parts, and they thought it was better to keep them as they are. Another problem appeared, translating the word shadow. It's a very critical and important word in the whole book. Translating the word, I'm sorry, that will come in a minute. Translating compound names that are not invented but become semantically loaded and creatively invented when unexpectedly combined together. Like the key word here, the Earthsea, the Earthsea. Basically, it was translated and kept as it is because it's the main name of the whole universe, the trademark of the whole series. But in the translator's introduction, it was followed by this explanatory phrase, بلاد البر والبحر, which literally means the countries that consist of lands and seas. And then there was the compound name sparrowhawk. Sparrowhawk is a word that exists, and it has an Arabic equivalent. It actually means a baby hawk in English, and it has an equivalent in Arabic, which is al-maysan. But I thought that no teenager, no an adult would go and buy a book with the name al-maysan. I never knew the name before looking it up in a dictionary. So it was transliterated, and I kept it as it is, and I thought it has a musical sound that actually I liked. Another problem popped up, which was translating the very elusive word shadow. In the first chapters, it actually meant a simple shade, a dark casting upon the earth. This is why it is translated in the first chapters as zil. But this shadow turns to be an external power dissociated from Ged's body and acquires an ability to insert itself in other people's bodies and act for them. Here it becomes shabah, or ghost. Then in the final chapters, it behaves in a different way. It follows Ged as a real shade, then it moves away from him as it pleases. Here I had to come up with a different term, which is dhil shabahi, or shadow-like ghost. There was another issue, which translating the names of the professors at the School of Wizards. It's full of wordplay. We have Master Chanter, Al-Ustaz Munshid, Master Windkey, Al-Ustaz Miftah al-Rih, Master Herbal, Al-Ustaz Oshbi, Master Hand, Al-Ustaz Kaf, Master Changer, Al-Ustaz Al-Muhawwil, the one that changes, Master Doorkeeper, Al-Ustaz Haris Bawabat al-Madrasa, Master Patterner, Sahib Al-Ansaq, the one who possesses the patterns, Master Summoner, Al-Ustaz Al-Mustahdir, the one who summons, Master Namer, Sahib al-Asma, the one who possesses the names, and then the Archimage, As-Sahir al-Akbar, the greatest of all mages. Then I had the tendency of the mother or the teacher to explain, and add explanations to make things clearer for the reader. I realized that there are some footnotes in my translations that were not a direct translation of any textual elements, but helpful explanations. First note was to explain the word archipelago in Arabic, which is a rather uncommon word, just like sparrowhawk, because it keeps being repeated in the novel, and because the geographical shape of this universe is essential to be rightly visualized, I thought of inserting this footnote. الأرخبيل هو أحد أشكال سطح الأرض التي ترمز إلى مجموعة متجاورة ومتقاربة من الجزر, which more or less literally means that the archipelago is one of the Earth's geographical shapes, and it consists of adjacent groups of islands. Another one of those notes is in this part of the text that says, quote, "She taught me the true name of the falcon, to which the falcon must come." Here, a footnote is inserted to explain the concept of the true name of things in Earthsea. Though this is already explained in the introduction, I don't count much on the young readers to stop and read it. A footnote is perhaps much more immediate to them. Again, this addition is not a word-for-word equivalence, but a deeper kind of translation of the writer's philosophy in Earthsea world in general. الاسم الحقيقي للأشياء أو الأشخاص في الرواية هو الجوهر الذي يمكن من خلاله إحداث السحر أو التأثير في أي شيء أو السيطرة عليه وحبسه في ماهيته. Literally, this means in Earthsea, the true name of things or persons is the essence through which magic can be worked on anything or anyone, control or bind them. One last of these explanatory footnotes. In the text, the master hand looked at the jewel that glittered on Ged's palm, bright as the prize of a dragon's hoard. The idea of the dragon's hoard refers to one of the basic ideas of fantasy genre. The hoard of a dragon is its protected treasure, and it's explained in a footnote. في حكايات الفانتازيا للتنين كنز من الجواهر الثمينة يحتفظ به في مكان من المستحيل الوصول إليه. I thought it was important because at a certain point, the dragon, our dragon here, actually starts to try to deal with Ged, try to bribe him with one of his jewels in order not to control him. This literally means in fantasy, a dragon has a hoard of precious jewels that it keeps in an unreachable place. This strategy is a strategy I used to make the translated text more reachable, more attainable, and actually I tended here towards acceptability. Then there was the issue of the cover, and the cover is always a part of the text. In these 3 slides, we have some of the original covers of the novel in English. As you can see, we have a repetition of certain elements. We have a flying or sitting dragons, falcons, the sea, a castle, a man with a stick, and a shadow. There has to be a cover in Arabic, a new cover in Arabic. And then there was a suggested design, which at first looked nice, generally, especially to an inexperienced reader. However, it could not translate the cover, the suggested cover, could not translate the ideas conveyed in the text. Though there is a dragon and a young man in the picture, something was seriously wrong with them. Ged is not a dragon knight or rider in this part of the series, so he cannot be riding the dragon by all means. More important, the dragon in this picture is far from the dragon in the text, the dragon of Pendor. The dragon of Pendor is very old and primitive, very mean, while the dragon in the illustration is tamed, young, strong, and armored. The dragon of Pendor appears standing face to face with a young, ashamed, and burdened Ged in chapter 5 of the novel. Their verbal duels results in a deal that neither the dragon nor its young should attack the islands of Earthsea, in return forgets keeping the dragon's true name as a secret forever. Moreover, the general impression that this cover leaves is of a children's story. And though young adult literature is still part of general category of children's literature, this novel is much heavier than that. To find a suitable cover for Arabic Earthsea, I had to find a young fantasy lover artist who can understand the story and translate its elements into a cover. And then, again, once again, my son Yusuf helped me with that. He suggested one of his fantasy lover friends, and we have Mustafa Negmi here, the designer, who did the following and the official cover for the Arabic Earthsea. In the following cover, there are major elements of Gates' story: his shame, cloak, stick, small boat, his faded features representing every young man or woman, and basically his courage in front of the unknown. Even the type of font that he used to write the titles conveys a general feeling of mystery. How about reading a part of the original text and the translated text? Small part. It's a conversation that takes place between Ged and his first master, Master Ogion, one of the important mages in Earthsea, and he is a very, very wise man who has been trying to teach him patience ever since he became one of his apprentices. He tells him, "There's no safe place." Ogion said gently, "Do not transform yourself again, Ged. The shadow seeks to destroy your true being. It nearly did so, driving you into a hawk's being. No. Where you should go, I do not know. Yet, I have an idea of what you should do. It's a hard thing to say to you." Ged's silence demanded truth, and Ogion said at last, "You must turn around." Turn around? If you go ahead, if you keep running, wherever you run, you will meet danger and evil, for it drives you. It chooses the way you go. You must choose. You must seek what seeks you. You must hunt the hunter. قال أوغيون بهدوء: لا يوجد مكان آمن لك. لا تحول نفسك ثانية يا جد. يسعى الشبح لتدميرك ويدفعك لهوية الصقر. لا، ولا أعرف إلى أين يجب أن تذهب. ومع هذا فعندي فكرة من الصعب أن أطرحها عليك. حرك صمت جد أوغيون لأن ينطق بالحقيقة، فقال أخيرا: عليك أن تستدير راجعا. أستدير راجعا؟ لو تقدمت للأمام، أعني لو وصلت الجري، أينما تهرب ستجد الخطر والشر، لأنه يسوقك ويدفعك ويختار الطريق الذي تمشي فيه. عليك أن تختار. عليك أن تبحث عمن يبحث عنك. عليك أن تصطاد الصياد. And then, in 2010, 1 year before I started the translation, I was in a translation workshop in the National Center for Translation and with Dr. Mustafa Riyad. Professor Mustafa Riyad used to say to us, "You literary translators should not ever go to sleep with a clear conscience when there is a word that lies unsettled in your text." His words kept repeating, kept ringing in my ears while I was translating Earthsea. I know I never went to sleep with a clear conscience when there was a word that lay unsettled. But I know I might have fallen asleep and left some parts and some things unsettled and forgot all about them. Ladies and gentlemen, this was all about The Arabic Wizard of Earthsea, an imperfect translation of a perfect book, a book full of wizardry and magic, but actually it's more about the magic of growing up, the magic of discovering oneself, the magic of discovering one's true identity. It's a story of man and his or her shadow. Thank you very much.
If I understood correctly from the introduction, you dealt with French science fiction?
Sorry?
From the introduction, did you deal with French science fiction before?
French
Yeah.
science fiction?
Yeah.
No.
Oh,
I
okay.
don't read French. My major is in English literature, in fact, American science fiction.
Okay. I was going to ask a question about French science fiction.
I'm so sorry, but
Thank you very much for such an interesting lecture. Myself would love to have the opportunity to translate a work of fantasy from Arabic into English. But that, in a way, is... First of all, I suppose my one question simply is, as a matter of interest, is there much Arabic, is there much fantasy fiction written originally in Arabic? And would you consider it to be an independent genre or derivative of its English language and other language equivalents? The other question I have, or thought, is that quite often it seemed to me that you were talking about a deeper level of translation, and that seemed to me to be equivalent more or less to glossing or explaining. And I'm wondering, for example, when you talked about the use of the shifting use of the word shadow in the English text, am I correct in thinking that the word in the English text remains shadow throughout? So why is it necessary to explain more to an Arabic reader than the author thought it appropriate to explain to the English reader? And is it not possibly depriving the reader of some of the pleasure and some of the involvement that comes with working out exactly what is going on when it is not obvious, by glossing such things, by writing footnotes, by telling them what you think is happening, by using add-on translations, add-on terms, as you called them? Thank you.
of course, I will start with the second question first, please. I think you're making an excellent point here, and actually, I need to question this tendency, my tendency to explain and explain further and not leaving things exactly as they are, and perhaps I will. That might be one of the things that I will need to think about and edit if they are reprinting it in any way at any time in the future. But the word shadow in English looked perfect in all situations, but in Arabic the word ظل, الظل يتحرك, الظل يهاجم, الظل, it sounded very strange. It sounded very strange to me. I needed to explain what's going on. I needed to explain that there is a change of identity of that black thing that keeps haunting Ged throughout and keeps changing its identity. It keeps driving from Ged's power. The more it drives Ged of power, the more it changes and becomes stronger and freer to act and freer to cast evil things on earth. But I think I have a long list of things to think about and change in this. I said that during the lecture. For me, it's a project in process. For me, it's a project in process. Yes. As for the first question, old Arabic literature is actually full of fantasy, and the Arabian Nights and all those fantasies were actually told to children as bedtime stories. But we don't have modern Arabic fantasy. We don't have modern Arabic fantasy. It seems that we're sort of 1 century late from what goes on in those peripheral, marginal genres of literature, which is science fiction and fantasy and detective stories. We seem to be late, and we seem to acquire things slowly and produce them slowly, though we have a long and established and very strong tradition to rely on. And I don't know, I mean, if you go with the traffic of Cairo every day, do you think you will ever have the ability to think of a fantasy world? I don't know. Yes, yes. You know, I don't live in Cairo. I did not used to live in Cairo before marriage. I only started living in Cairo 21 years ago. Before that, I used to live in Tanta, which is a regional town. And when I started living in Cairo, the traffic was a kind of trauma to me. So I started rehearsing being in and out at the same minute, being inside a taxi, for example, and my soul would be out somewhere else. Never mind that this somehow is making me go into the direction of being a schizophrenic person or something, but then the traffic actually, you're right, made me think of another world, of a fantasy world. Yes.
Please, Hannah. As for the same example, you haven't given a thought to the word taif for shadow. This is number one. And number two, I presume you've been working and meditating a lot about synonyms. I wonder how clear your conscience is for using the word Sedara ragi'an instead of Sedara a'idan. Thank you. The whole thing is just how synonyms are meditated upon.
Well, after mentioning the word taif, I think I don't have a clear conscience towards this word. Yes, I have a very bad conscience right now. استدار عائدا أو استدار راجعا. No, I need to think about it. I need to think about it. But it could be a nice thing to start thinking this way. But taif, the word taif is very logical here. Yeah. No, I haven't used it.
Yeah. As an Arabic writer interested in fantasy, I have read a lot of works for Lord Dunsany, Tolkien, Lovecraft, Arthur McKean. I may ask, do you think the Arabic writer should stick to Arabian Nights and all Guinea, something like that? Or may I use dragon, elf, fairies in the fantasy? A lot of publishing houses say that, oh no, this is a Western fantasy, we don't publish that, we need you to write Egyptian. So they don't like when introduced to fantasy, Egyptian fantasy work, it don't have much chance of being published because of this. What do you think about this as writer, not translator?
Okay. Speculative genres like fantasy seem to compile ideas and images and symbols, and writers all over the world are entitled to reuse, rework, expand on, contradict, do what they like. Especially in fantasy, we don't have to abide by any law except that it's fantasy. But when you are creating a second universe, a new world, you need to be very consistent, and you need to be very logical, and you need to know that it's a great responsibility because you are creating a new world, and you have to have something to say. You need to say something about that. We don't have to, as Arabic writer, we don't have to stick to genies or mermaids. We can use whatever we want. We can even invent other different life forms. We can do what we want. But let me tell you this. Even when we invent new forms of life, new aliens, new shapes, we are still moving inside the borders of what we know on Earth. You know, even the aliens in science fiction, they look like reptiles. They are three-eyed people. They look like monsters. We as human beings cannot actually visualize, cannot actually imagine a truly alien thing because we always write about what we know, but we keep changing it.
I would like to thank you very much for this very interesting lecture and for your work, which I think you had very strong passion towards it in order to be able to finish. I cannot imagine myself translating all of that. In this sense, I would like to ask you how much time did it take you to finish it? Thank you.
It took me 1 year to finish it, 3 years to publish it, because it happened that it was in the National Center for Translation at a time when about 5 ministers of culture were being changed, and at a certain point I actually doubted that it would ever be published, and so it took all that time, yes. But it took 1 year of translating, a few months before that researching on fantasy.
Okay, I have a series of questions actually. Yani short. I was wondering about the venue of publication. Yani why the National Center for Translation when this is a work for young adults, and you mentioned Nahdat Masr that published Harry Potter and already therefore developed a reputation for this kind of fiction. Why did you not go to them? That's one. Two, having said that, I know that Nahdat Masr's translation of Harry Potter was very problematic. Very problematic. So I'm really surprised that it continues to sell well. And I just wonder about the readership, and maybe the younger crowd here can comment on that, because last year we had somebody speak about Harry Potter, and she had done a sample translation herself to challenge Nahdat Masr's rendition of the series, and she chose to Arabize the names, and she also chose to have them speak in Egyptian Arabic rather than formal modern standard, in order for the translation to actually speak to that younger audience that is the target of the series. Okay. And therefore my question to you...
I will forget. I mean... Can I answer those first and then...
هي آخر واحد.
Okay.
Your use of the modern standard rather than the vernacular, or at least a sort of an oscillation between them in order to sharpen the many voices that actually seem to be there in the text, even as a distinguishing factor between the different characters, the status, etc., the age.
As usual, I will start with the third point because I tend to forget. I mean, I haven't got enough sleep in a week. The language level. I thought that since our Arabic readership enjoyed Harry Potter with all its problems, and as I mentioned, that the Nahdat Masr are actually editing all the translations, and they intend to finish the editing in about a year or something. It's a huge project and it's very painful. I know. And that means that they are interested, and that means that it's still selling strongly in the market. I did not go to them because somehow I know, but I still can't prove that, is that this is the journal story for Harry Potter. This is the first writer to talk about a school of wizards ever. And it's quite legitimate for Rowling to take the idea and expand it and rework it and use it in her work. I did not think that they would be interested in somehow a competitive work. No, Al-Shuruq would leave it for years. If I'm not an acknowledged, published before translator, I would be just left for years. it took me years in the National Center for Translation, but at least to publish. I knew they were having hard times, but they accepted the project. They were convinced that it deserved translation. So that answers the first question. The language level, so I saw that my son, at a very young age, he was like 9 years old when he started reading Harry Potter. He read it in that difficult language, and he observed it, and it seems that the fantasy readers are actually more interested in what's going on, in the adventure, more than they're interested in the language. And they would, maybe he and Yusuf and Mustafa can, and by the way, this is Yusuf, this handsome young man, and this is Mustafa, another handsome young man. I thought that if they could observe that, if they could like that, they will definitely like a modern Arabic, reasonable language, and go along with it. I did not use the vernacular. No, we don't have a great variety in dialects in A Wizard of Earthsea. No, they seemed all to speak in a middle, not middle, in good English. They all seem to speak in good, respectable, and understandable and easy to reach English. So we don't have that. We don't have so many dialogues. Actually, I thought that I chose that dialogue because I thought it's nice because it tells about the relationship between the student, the apprentice, and his master. But we don't have so many dialogues. I can even count them, and we don't have this variety of language to use vernacular and modern Arabic. What was the third question? See? But if you want to engage the young readership, talking about can I give you the mic?
Another one.
It seems like they got a translator for each chapter. It's inconsistent. The translators weren't immersed in the fiction. They didn't feel it. It's like an assignment for college or something. I love the Harry Potter story because I read it in English. But when I read it again in Arabic, it was terrible. But that's where I first started because I wasn't that fluent in English then. What was the other question? Yes, it's terrible. Okay.
And actually, you're absolutely right. I mean, several translators were commissioned to translate the same volume because they wanted it out immediately as the Harry Potter originals were coming out.
The same terms were translated in different ways.
Exactly.
And regarding the modern Arabic, I think of it as a bad idea to translate English into modern Arabic, English fantasy into modern Arabic, because it takes out of the magic and beauty of the Fusha Arabic.
So you wanted it.
Yes, I want him Fusha.
And you wanted him to eat eggs and bacon, for example.
No.
He eats eggs and bacon in this house. I mean, there's a scene where they're having breakfast.
In Harry Potter? Or
Harry Potter. And how do you, if we go back to the idea of culturally specific?
no, not. Oh, okay.
So what would he eat if it's not eggs and bacon?
No, I'm okay with translating the culture, but not into modern Arabic, not into Egyptian Arabic, because.
That's a really fascinating issue. I never thought of eggs and bacon. People whatever it is, 80% of this country do not eat bacon, right? Did that disgust them when they see their hero eating eggs and pig meat?
For
Would
me,
that be a negative connotation for them? And in that case, would you be justified in changing that into full with Tahrir? Or would that be to completely divorce the thing from the context that you know that it's in? You know that this kid, this Harry, is an English schoolboy. So if you make him eat full Tahrir, you know, how could that happen? So obviously there would be some problem. It seems to me there would be a problem either way, and I'm not sure what the solution is.
I'm reading fantasy. I'm immersed in another culture, in another language, another word. It wouldn't be such a problem to
The fact that somebody
that,
is eating bacon.
that somebody,
doesn't
yes,
worry.
yes,
Okay.
and it doesn't seem that offensive.
Good.
Doesn't seem
Okay.
offensive.
That's great.
To me and my
I
peers,
would much prefer not
to me and my
convert that.
yes, to me and my peers, it doesn't seem offensive.
You know, the point is, fantasy and science fictions are genres that actually depend on estrangement, estranging the reader into a different world so that he or she can be in a different world and read our world in a better way. So, seriously, Arabizing the context and making the level of language that simple into vernacular Arabic would actually make us lose much of that estranging technique. Yes, that's it.
Concerning translating English into Arabic or Arabic into English, wouldn't it be easier to have bilingual literature where you have an Arabic guy writing Arabic fantasy, writing it originally in English instead of getting somebody to translate, and you could have an appendix at the end or the beginning explaining certain key terms?
I mean, I didn't get that. I don't seem to get that. I mean, you don't want to translate it fantasy, or?
Well, why not, you know, cut the middleman out of it and actually do it straight away in English? And the author himself, if he's bilingual.
But the author is not bilingual. Ursula K doesn't speak Arabic.
No, I mean, if we're going to pioneer Egyptian science fiction, you could do it straight away in English instead of translating it.
We still don't have Arabic science fiction because we are not a science-producing culture.
Sure.
You know, we're consumers. We consume sets and gadgets, but we don't even think scientifically or critically to produce science fiction. I mean, it would be easier to produce fantasy if there is a willing author who is ready to do it. طب والtranslators ياكلوا عيش منين يعني? How are translators going to live?
They can become authors themselves.
They
embody
a good
knowledge.
literary translator is an author, and I say I was translating Earthsea exactly at the same time I was working on myself as a creative writer, and now I'm at a stage that I think that I write creative writing in Arabic in a better way, and I'm very eager to edit the work seriously, you know.
And one other quick thing, just a suggestion. I mean, illustrations, you have the front cover, but you can have also, I mean, like a picture book for children's stories. Would that help a lot?
That's a good point. My younger daughter, Mariam, who isn't an avid reader like Yusuf, but likes moving and pictures more, suggested that Ursula K. would write, or I would write as her translator, I would write a simplified version of Earthsea. And I sent Le Guin an email asking her to do that, and she objected strongly. She said, it has been written for young adult readers, and it will remain a young adult fantasy that can be read by adults quite freely, but children need to grow up a little bit to be able to read it. So she objected, and I can't, in my lifetime, I can't admit that to happen against her will. Might happen later, because in children's literature in particular, the Arab children's literature, we did all sorts of adaptations and stealings, and you know, the beginnings of Arab children's literature was actually a kind of free adaptations of all the folk tales, the Western folk tales, and all the stories. But now things are getting more distinctive and clearer, and there are writers for Arab children's literature. Hopefully we will have a fantasy work soon.
A small notice about the language that a lot of fantasy writers like Tolkien and Lovecraft and Lord Dunsany seems to like to use archaic English like thou, thee. It seems like in our case العربية الفصحى is better for fantasy. It gives the feel اللي need to use from the everyday world to the new world. So I think فصحى is the best method to translate fantasy into Arabic.
Yes, but in Earthsea, Le Guin did not use thou or thee. She used simple but mystical English. English that it has, I don't know. I mean, I'm not clear-minded enough now to describe it, but it's that simple. But actually, every word counts. Every word seems to be in its place.
Yes, I know, but I was thinking about not just Earthsea, but fantasy. It seems like Middle Ages style in food and clothes, and so the language, the archaic language, suited better, as I think.
Of course, but not every writer who would use archaic language would be a good fantasy writer, Again, he has, if he or she are going to create a secondary universe, they need to have a message and they need to be very consistent.
Thank you.
Hi. You really struck a chord with me when you said we are still moving in the visual of what we know on Earth. And what was going on in my mind when you said that, and I'm going to go into my question, was when we go back and look at some of these fantasy-oriented, in Arabic, but also in other parts of the world, I've noticed this type of connection that when we look at ancient civilizations, how some of them, they who really understood outside of Earth, had a connection with outside of Earth, with the universe, with the planets, with the stars, taking those and not only incorporate them in their spiritual traditions, but incorporating them in their art and storytelling and mythology. So I'm wondering if, particularly in the Arabic world and Arabic literature, as we look at the science fiction and the world of the magical, have various Arab writers tried to go back and take a look at some of the ancient civilizations here in this region of the world, to go back and see if there's anything that maybe we didn't highlight that we can bring forth, and using that as something that's new in Arabic literature of the mythical and the magic.
I'm not sure if anyone has done that or not. Apparently not. But I think I know the reason. Again, as Wafa Dokmak said, it's a tradition that some ideas, some Islamic ideas and rules and the Arabic nationalism would actually make all the children literature more or less moralizing. So the writers would love to be away from the imaginary worlds or the fairy tales or whatever might spoil a child's brain. Only recently, writers are becoming freer to imagine that, if we are talking about children literature, of course. But I'm sure that we have a very strong tradition to go back to. And again, writing is like a river that goes and things happen on the banks, and it's never the same river again. It's a human tradition. I mean, we are licensed to read Western literature and get affected by it and change what we write about, exactly as the West did with the Arabian Nights and was influenced by it. I'm not sure what's going on in the. I know that the only science fiction story written recently was Amr Khalid's story, Rafi Barakat, who was published last year by Nahdat Misr, and I wrote something on it in Arab literature in translation, and it was very, very clear, very scientific, again moralizing and didactic, but it was at least it was the first attempt in quite some time. There's an important idea I need to say now before I forget it. It's about the movies of Wizard of Earthsea. One of the things that made Harry Potter very popular is the cinematic productions of it. They tried the same with A Wizard of Earthsea, but then it didn't work because they did not keep the main ideas of the writer. For example, the hero, the main hero, Guin, in the story is a very thin, dark, young man who looks more like a Red Indian. Imagine a Red Indian young man. But in the story, in the movie, it became a blonde, white actor. So that actually angered her a lot because it looked to her like they are using the series in a way that she did not mean, and she refused to go on with the cinematic production. Only one movie that she wouldn't even acknowledge. She never told me about it. I found it while searching on the internet. When asking her why you never told me there was, I hated it. She said, I hated it, and I don't want to talk about it because there was a message that she was trying to convey, is that it's not always about the white Western people. It's always about man in any color, a man with any color. So this is one thing, this is one reason the series is not as famous as Potter. Plus, it's not as adventurous, it's not as fast-paced as Potter. It has a lot of values there and a lot of wisdom to be gained.
Can I pick up on that? You've several times mentioned that in Arabic literature, Arabic children's literature, the emphasis is on moralizing. But surely these are extremely moralizing books. These also are moralizing books. Yeah. As you said, there are values, there are messages. This, I have to admit, with shame, I haven't read it, but it does, even from the little bit that we've seen this evening, it seems to be a coming-of-age story in which a young man faces the things that young men face and comes to terms with them. That is, so what is then the essential difference? I don't think it lies in them being moralizing or not moralizing. Perhaps it lies in the vocabulary and the aesthetics. I don't mean the literal vocabulary, I mean the cultural vocabulary, the ability to access and the willingness and enthusiasm to access ideas that are not simply practical. And correct me if I'm wrong here, but does not Islam say, or do not some interpreters of the religion say, that that which is not directly of benefit to your religion is to be rejected? That would seem to certainly circumscribe the worlds, the ideas that a writer of fantasy must necessarily have at his or her disposal. So I don't think it's a question of moralizing versus non-moralizing. And just one other point, since I have the microphone, that you have said, you mentioned a couple of times that the world of fantasy is a second universe, an enclosed universe, not part of our universe. But it seems to me that the works of fantasy with which I'm familiar, for example, the Narnia books by C.S. Lewis, and Tolkien's works, are extremely linked to our universe. Anybody who fails to see the Christian, not to mention the British imperial resonances in the Narnia books, which in my opinion in no way detracts from their value or their skill, is clearly not reading the books well. Likewise, Tolkien, what is the Shire but every Englishman's fantasy of a little cozy little community that we all live in, and we get a little scared when we leave. So the worlds need to be internally consistent, but they certainly have bridges to the quote-unquote real world as well.
First, I made it clear that I'm a middle-aged woman who has been raised in a culture that thinks of children's literature as somehow should carry a message of teaching the kids or children something. So whatever I say, I belong to that tradition. Secondly, Ursula K. herself, when she wrote that, at least part one, she was asked by the publisher to write something for young adult readers. See, so it's not something that she came up with. No, it's something that she sat down and decided to write for young adult readers. So she surely had a message. And that her message was how to teach them to come of age, how to teach them to grow. She said that growing up is a process that takes years. She herself grew up at 31. Not even before the 20s. Some people actually die without growing up in that sense of embracing themselves, of accepting that dark part in themselves. The book is still somehow moralizing, and it's fine to be moralizing, but again, it differs from many fantasy works. It differs from a lot of children's works that it doesn't lead us to a dichotomy between evil and good. Evil is always seen as part of ourselves that has to be faced, contained, accepted to go on with our lives. Secondary universes are consistent, estranging, but definitely reflect our world. We cannot, where are we going to go? Whatever we imagine, whatever we write, we are trapped in this world somehow, but we find different ways of expressing our world, of telling stories about our world and ourselves, through which we come to understand the same world in a better way.
Any more questions?
Whether or not we're writing fantasy at all in Arabic, right? And I just want to remind us of someone like Zakaria Tamir's stories that we read as adults, but also were published by Dar al-Fata al-Arabi for children, and they were illustrated. Have you seen that collection, Humphrey? Yeah. So it's not that they're not there. I think that there's always been, especially perhaps in times of crisis, a tendency to resort to the fantastic, the absurd, and Naguib Mahfouz is another example. When in the 60s, people started saying, he's gone crazy, we don't understand what he's writing about. When you, I don't know if you're familiar with Tahta al-Madalla. It's a beautiful short story that is completely absurd. And it was deliberately written the way it was written, so that he would avoid censorship. But also I'm thinking now, Ahmed Neki. Roger Mean. لا بعرفوش لا. No, I was thinking about the comics, this budding genre now that is, inclined towards the fantastic. I'm thinking of a particular one that is called Qahira. Has anybody seen that? By a woman caricaturist, in which the heroine is a superheroine. She's a superwoman, basically, and her name is Qahira. And she is a veiled woman who, takes on the street and harassers on the street And so, you know, she sort of looks pretty normal, and then suddenly she sort of becomes larger than life, and she beats up the guys, and, you know, and it's really, you know, you can, I think that this new genre that is gaining ground is probably a space where we might witness, you know, interesting works of the fantastic, yeah.
I just remembered something concerning the word taif. Forgive me because I haven't had enough sleep in a while. Yes, I thought of using the word taif, but again in Arabic it has very romantic connotations, while the thing that I was trying to translate is a very vicious thing that was attacking Gad and attacking others and actually killed a couple of people. Sorry? It's, I mean, it didn't look, but shabah always has to do with something that fearful and frightening. Mm-hmm. Yes.
My theoretical question was that, have you meditated enough on synonyms? Thank you. That's all. I mean, those are only examples, but I think the translator should meditate all the time on synonyms. And this is the interest of Fosha. Because Fosha offers, I mean, in the case of the famous case about Abu al-Ala al-Ma'ari and the dog, 44 synonyms.
Oh.
For the dog in Arabic, and for other, of course, for other things, like for, in this case, shadow. Mm-hmm. Shadow would be a homonym, actually, in English. So it should be translated in this, in this diaphragmatic way that you translated it. You chose once shabah and once again zil. Khayal would also be admitted.
Yeah.
But theoretically, my question is, as a translator, are you a translator who meditates on synonyms? Because but this is the issue.
Can any good translator meditate enough? I mean, it's an ongoing process. I know now that I have a lot to learn, that I'm not sure that even my lifetime would be enough for it. I mean, I've been trying with Dr. Samia Mehres for years to get that master's in translation studies in the ASC, and it's not working. I know I need to learn more, I know I need to, but it's exhilarating, and it's dear. I mean, when you translate a book like that, it becomes like part of you somehow. So you defend it. But I'm reasonable enough to admit that I have mistakes, and I have made mistakes, and it's full of flaws that I'm ready to edit if I was ever given the chance to do that.
I was thinking about something when Sir talked about the Shire. I think what they call Merry England, the old countryside with tea and
all the greenery and.
I guess what made fantasy very famous is being anti-urban, as they usually describe Tolkien.
Yes.
The orc in his novels using machines. He fought in the World War, and he saw what the machine can do to human life. So he hated. He wanted the old life back. So I guess fantasy is not about our current time. It's about nostalgia for old ages and middle ages.
Okay, when you are nostalgic about old things, it means that you're not comfortable with the current time. So somehow it's again about our current times. You know, again, we always remember this estranging technique, that these speculative genres actually estrange you, so that you can actually understand your world in a better way.
Do you think fantasy is a way to escapism, as he usually describes it?
Some of the very commercial fantasies are escapist, yes, but not classical fantasies like this one.
What do you think about what novel is wrote for pure entertainment, without moral?
It makes people feel fine, okay, fine. But you always have something to say, even when you only need to entertain.
Thank you.
This is Mustafa, our designer. And she liked, by the way, Ursula K. Guin liked his cover very much.
Okay. It's just a question coming from a person who is obviously not a translator or something. I just spend most of my time, on a graphic tablet instead of a typewriter. But I just wanted to ask about your opinion regarding the point of the language, which is the novel is written by, especially the Arabic part. Okay. As Dr. Sami mentioned, Qahira, it was some sort of a fantasy graphic short novel, or a series of comics, which was written in actually Egyptian Arabic. Okay. My question is regarding the point which I want to talk about. I am a teenager, okay, which when I find any book written in Egyptian Arabic, okay, I find it more relatable. I can relate to it since it's the language I use in my everyday life, On the other hand, when I find a book written in traditional Arabic or in Arabiya al-Fusha, all my respect to traditional Arabic, of course, but I feel like it's more serious, or it's more hard to relate to than the Egyptian Arabic, So I wanted just to hear your opinion about the part where is it right, or is it better to use nowadays the Egyptian Arabic in our novels instead of traditional Arabic, since it's obviously more used in the streets, especially by us, by the teenager, or actually everyone here. Just that. I was asking about that point here.
Do you read Mickey? Mickey?
Of course.
It's more or less comics, and we love the characters, Batuta and Zizi and Mimi, and it's still written in classical Arabic. And children read it and love it. Okay. Even adults.
Yeah, I get your point.
But again, this can work with comics, but like Yusuf said, fantasy is more or less heavy, mystical. Lowering the level of language, or using the vernacular, colloquial Arabic would actually detract something from its magical power.
Okay, one last question.
Plus, I'm a mother who would love to see her children know Arabic well. I cannot deny this motive, that I am very pissed off, very angry when I see my own students use Anglo-Arab instead of Arabic or English.
Yeah, of course. My question is, what do you think of a fantasy novel written in Egyptian Arabic?
Why don't you work on that, Mustafa? You and you. I mean, I can see that you love the genre, and you have compiled enough ideas to do that.
Okay.
And in every country, always writers work with illustrators that sometimes you cannot even differentiate between who writes and who illustrates. So why don't you both work on that? That would be just fantastic. Something coming from you to your peers.
Okay, I'll try that one day. Okay, thank you.
Well, okay, this was a very engaging and engaged discussion. Thank you so much for a wonderful lecture. Thank you for being here despite, the emergency that you have at home.
It did me good to be away for some time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.